All right, so it's time for our final speaker of the day. And you may have noticed that in the first half of our program, we really talked a lot about events that led up to the regulation and covered a lot prior to 1765 through 1771. And this afternoon, we have talked about what happens after, which is sort of a big question that we get at Alamance Battleground. And to talk with us for our final presentation, we are joined by Vann Evans. Vann is employed with the State Archives of North Carolina and has been since 2007, and currently serves as Audiovisual Materials Archivist. Vann previously taught high school history in North Carolina and is currently writing a history of Wilkesboro. His interest in the regulation and the colonial North Carolina backcountry is primarily focused on religious conflict and its influence, and the impact of denominational affiliation and Revolutionary era allegiances. His talk today is titled Religion, Regulators, and Roots of the Moores Creek Uprising, 1771 to 1776. Vann, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah. Can everybody hear me and see me okay? All right. I will forewarn you, I have two little regulators running around the house. So if anyone barges in the door or if you hear a protest outside, know that is just my crew here. Thanks to the earlier presenters, Dr. Troxler and Dr. Stewart and Mark. I really all of your presentations, and I always enjoy learning from each of you, and continue to do so. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and let me get that shared here. Let's see here. So many of you, probably my title may be slightly misleading, but many of you know that the Moores Creek Uprising, or the Battle of Moores Creek, in February of 1776 was chiefly comprised by Scottish Highlanders. But the plan had been for Governor Josiah Martin to really align regulators in the backcountry settlements of North Carolina and other supporters with that uprising. And it failed for a variety of different reasons. But I want to look at, in particular, I think, what are some of the roots of that failure in the northwestern Piedmont area of the backcountry, and what was then Rowan and Surrey counties, and even a portion of Guilford County, where there had been an amount of regulator unrest or sympathy. A lot of my research really tries to wrestle with these opposing points of view. Religion has the capacity to unite. It's in the civil rights movement, or in the case of the regulation, more modern scholars have shown how various Protestant groups came together to challenge sort of the grievances that they had. But religion also has the capacity to divide. And a lot of British historians in particular, and early historians of the colonies, have recognized that prior to any sort of formal political parties, the interest groups and the factions that emerged in the colonies often had close ties to ethnic groups or denominational groups, religious affiliation. And that would have been true in a lot of the colonies. And it was also the case in North Carolina. Who were the regulators? What were their religious affiliations? I think contemporaries do a pretty good job of summarizing that. husband himself says that we found our body to consist promiscuously of all sex, and the men who we put the most trust in were of the Church of England communion. Another Gazette also recognized this and uh, found it striking that there were groups of composed of different principles, civil and religious, as well as interest. And I think by interest he meant economic interest. The latter part of Husband's comment there, that the men who we put most of our trust in were of the Church of England communion, has become really kind of the focal point of my research. There's a long-standing, I think, tradition in a lot of the scholarship on North Carolina, both in denominational histories and wider colonial histories, that the Church of England, in particular, which was the established church in the colony, was weak, and that is certainly the case. And I think as we carry over into discussions about the backcountry, the frontier areas, it's even more pervasive that it was a source of weakness. I think that view requires a little bit more refinement in terms of the particular places where people settled and who those settlers were. And that, in some previous conferences and presentations, I've tried to, I think, shed a little bit more additional unique differences in these areas. Prior to 1770, Carol and Mark had alluded to this, is that the northwestern portion of North Carolina, the Piedmont, was consisted of Rowan and Orange County. But right in the middle of the Regulator trouble, 1771 session of the Assembly, 4 or 5 months before Alamance, the Colonial Assembly divided Orange and Rowan. It created Guilford out of the western third of Orange and eastern third of Rowan. It created Surrey out of the northern half of Rowan, and then it also chopped off a portion of the southern portion of Orange to create Chatham County. These were important conciliatory sort of gestures that the regulators very much wanted. They reduced the distance to courthouses. It expanded the numbers of justices of the peace in those counties. It brought greater government, and it created more power and leverage in the colonial assembly. One of the things, though, that it also did was it created some challenges, particularly for the Church of England. 71 on. Parishes in this time were mostly contiguous with county boundary. For example, St. Luke's Parish was the parish, the Episcopal parish for Rowan County. St. Jude's Parish and Dobbs parishes were in Southern County. That was unique in that the Moravians, the German settlers, the Moravians who lived in Surrey County, had their own parish at the time. And then Guilford County was Unity Parish, and then Orange County was St. Matthew's, and Chatham County was St. Bartholomew. One of the things that we know, and I'm sorry if my slides here aren't as clear as I had hoped, is that Presbyterians complicated measures to keep and sophisticated measures to keep the Church of England out. If we look closely at how they did some of those things, it ranged in Rowan, which was the most contentious county, I would argue, where Presbyterians they discouraged poor vote out during vestry elections by collecting fines of dissenting or Presbyterian freeholders who refused to come up and vote. So if you owned land and you could vote in the vestry elections and you did not show up, they fined you, and they used those fines to compensate informants and to even create a fund by which they could try to block the installation of Anglican rectors. One of the reasons successful in Rowan, I think is kind of evident by a sample of something that I'd like to show. The map on the left that's is a map created in 1773 of the Fourth Creek Presbyterian Church congregation. That is around the modern Statesville, North Carolina, and Iredell County. The names that were included on that map, all 196, they were all Presbyterian families. The other, they were not Presbyterian. To the right is a petition that was drafted by Anglicans in Rowan, and that includes I think roughly 189 names. I compared the names on the Anglican list with the names on the map of Fourth Creek Presbyterian Church to determine land ownership. And what I found is that in just the Fourth Creek congregation alone, there were 76 Presbyterians who owned land. And in the scattered list of Anglicans that was dispersed across about 8 or 9 settlements included 43 Anglicans. So not only were Presbyterians very much opposed to the Anglican Church, they were also in positions of power, and they were also, as a rule, more affluent, and they owned land. One of the reasons that they owned more land was since 1763, the Granville District land in the Granville Proprietary District had closed, and it left settlers without a means to actually purchase land and have it recorded in a. You could buy land, but you could not legally get a deed for it. What was often done was they claimed what were called axe entries, where they went out and they basically improved the property and claimed it. Sometimes the wealthier settlers would record a deed improvement, but most settlers just resided on a particular piece of land without any title to it, unless they could purchase granted land at an earlier pre-1763 date. Because Scots-Irish largest and earliest groups into the area, particularly between Salisbury and what would become Charlotte area, and they also owned deeds. They had deeds to the properties. This had enabled them to effectively block installations of Anglican rectors in the colonial period. In Rowan County, St. Luke's Parish, there had been fierce divisions since 1754. And in particular, in the heart of the regulation, when Theodorus Drake arrived in the area, that sentiment was reignited. In April of 1771, right before the Battle of Alamance, there was no vestry election held out of concern for fear of riots in Salisbury. And then in the following year, dissenters in Rowan County blocked Drake's induction, and he later left and went to Camden, South Carolina, where he died. One of the Anglican candidates in this time period, John Cohen, would later recall that these battles had created much bitter animosity to spring up between the parties. Keep that in mind. Unlike Rowan, however, Guilford County actually had some slight success. And I think that's important to note. When Rowan County was divided, it carved off its eastern third, where a portion of the Anglican population in the county had resided. The same is true for Surrey County. What happened in Guilford County, was that William Fields and John Kimbrough, both of whom were Anglican, Theodorus Drake, his installation as the Anglican rector in Rowan County, they introduced a bill to bar dissenters from on a vestry in Unity Parish. And by dissenters, they meant Presbyterians, not Baptists, not Quakers. They meant Presbyterians. The tangibly in the colonial period. One, because some of the other groups like Quakers were not conferred some of the same privileges that Presbyterians had been either. In Anglicans elected a vestry in Unity Parish, and they attempted to hire a minister but were unsuccessful. The enactment of the law, though, that had passed in 71 caused great discontent among Presbyterians, who complained that the law not only distinguished and put them on a worse footing than the rest of their set, but it deprived the freeholders of the freedom of choice of vestrymen, and it opened a door to civil as well as religious discord. Interestingly, Governor Josiah Martin, who had come to tour the backcountry in 1772 and had met with many of these ex-regulators, and in some cases Anglicans, had become convinced that the law was indispensable. And he would later say it was indispensably necessary to counter the machinations of the Presbyterians, and he gladly signed it into law. The case of Surry County is also sort of instructive, because when compared with Rowan, Guilford County, it presents sort of a different situation altogether. Dobbs Parish, the Moravian parish, essentially a facade. The Moravians were a unique religious group. They were certainly not Anglican, but they did in a series of measures, everything from issuing receipts to their ministers to having a vestry in name. Also provided English ministers which toured outside of their area into neighboring Surry County and Rowan County, and they often read from the Book of Common Prayer. They performed baptisms, and so they provided some of the same services that Anglican ministers also provide. When Surry County was created and St. Jude's Parish was formed, only 1 year did the parish not have a vestry election, and that was in 1771 when there was no sheriff to supervise. There were, in fact, Anglican ministers present, vestries elected, and tithes collected in St. Jude's Parish from 1772 to 1776. And the Reverend Hezekiah Ford was installed. He was a Virginian from, I think, Amelia County, Virginia, was installed as the first rector in 1774. And there is no documented opposition to his installation that I've been able to find. Some of this was because after Alamance, Surry County had significant population growth. Many of those settlers who had come from Virginia counties are known to have had strong Anglican ties. We have Wilkes County, and so, for example, the Gordon family, which would sit on the Surry County Committee of Safety, family. Some of these families had been very active as vestrymen and members of Anglican congregations. The established church in Virginia, they brought that too. They brought that with them. Joseph Winston, some of the other prominent Surry County settlers who came to the area in this period, likewise. And yet, from 1772 to 74, we really see the persistence of religious conflict and the formation of. There are a couple of things that happen that deserve note in this time period. In 1772, the British Privy Council disallowed two bills, one forming Queen's College in the Charlotte area, and outlawing or disallowing a bill that had allowed Presbyterian ministers, unlike Baptist or any other dissenting denomination, to perform marriages legally and to not have to turn over a full fee to the clerk of court or Anglican minister. These had been concessions granted by William Tryon during the Regulator troubles, and a suspending clause had been attached, which basically Tryon knew that these would not likely hold up, and they were shot down by the Privy Council. But the following year, Governor Josiah Martin reintroduced anti-Presbyterian bill. Martin had thought that the bill that Anglicans John Kimbrough and William Phills had introduced in 1771 specifically barred Presbyterians from serving on vestries throughout the province. But that was not the case. It was confined to Unity Parish that would specifically state that Presbyterians were barred from serving on vestries throughout the province. Just to clarify, there was nothing restricting a dissenter from serving on an Anglican vestry as long as he adhered to the various clergy acts or vestry acts in place. The case with Presbyterians, though, was that they blocked installation of Anglican rectors, or in some cases, they presented their vestry candidacy as an option of not having a vestry at all. And so Martin, unlike Tryon, was a little bit, I think, less inclined to pander to some of the Presbyterian interest groups, the Scotch-Irish interest groups in the western part of the colony, and this is problematic for him. At the same time, in 1773, led by a newly elected Guilford County representative, Alexander Martin, another bill was introduced to dissolve the Anglican vestry and rescind the tax, the church tax, the tithe, in Guilford County. I should note was his brother was an Anglican minister, but he had attended the College of New Jersey, which would become Princeton, and some of his biographers seem to indicate that he was more of maybe a deist or not particularly inclined to support one denomination over the other. Supposedly, when he settled in North Carolina, he became close friends with David Caldwell, who was the Presbyterian minister in what would become Guilford County. And he certainly quickly aligned himself with Presbyterians and was very much opposed to ministers in Rowan County. To the right, you'll see a faint piece of writing, and this is an archive. Occasionally, you run across things, documents that are not in places where they should be, or have become disorganized, or their significance may not necessarily be clear to the archivist who arranged the material. I found this document a few years ago, and it's on the back of a civil action paper for the Salisbury district, which was a district court that oversaw counties like Anson and Rowan. But what it says is to bring no commission for / Jacob fight, and instead Peter fight, as he is a Roman, to bring ye lieutenant commissions for Jacob Brown, and this is a handwritten note on the back of what is just sort of a normal civil action paper. There were allegations throughout this period that Presbyterians refused to issue or deliver commissions from the executive council, the governor's executive council, and deliver those commissions to the local county courts, both as justices of actually a lieutenant colonel commission or a lieutenant commission in the local aged throughout this time period in an effort to block office holding in some cases of people who they did not agree with. And the use of the term Roman there, I should say, is there are very few Catholics in the backcountry at this time. The term Roman there is used sort of pejorative for almost certainly for an Episcopalian or an Anglican. We'll see it over again, and I'll show you another example here shortly. There are a couple of other, I think, developments that are worth noting in this time period too. One has received less attention, but in 1774, Presbyterians exerted their influence to change the vestry laws that essentially granted the county courts the ability to administer poor relief, which was one of the major ecclesiastical functions of the parishes. The Anglican rector of Newbern James Reed, I think, remarked that it clearly evinced that Presbyterians had become the most powerful party in the House. Governor Martin actually acquiesced, and this is somewhat of an indication that at least at the provincial level, royal authority was also steadily declining. Two other important developments during this period that I want to note is one is of Lutheran alliances with Anglicans, both in form of worship. They were somewhat more close to one another than with Reformed Protestant congregations like German Reformed, Calvinist, or Presbyterian congregations. And when Theodore Estrada County, he was responsible for helping to, with the cooperation of the Bishop of London and local German Lutheran, help raise funds and bring over a Lutheran minister by the name of Adolf Nussmann, who would arrive in, it was either late 1772, early 73, in Mecklenburg County. And he would also minister to some other local congregations in that area. At the same time, German Reformed members were more closely aligning themselves with Presbyterians. And this became evident in the 1773 bill that Presbyterians attempted to revive in the legislature, where they asked for the privilege to be able to marry and not have to pay fees or fines, and also for to revive the act to create Queen's College in Charlotte. They were joined by German Protestants that I think can be established were of the German Reformed variety and not of the Lutheran. And I would say too that some of these lines are limited to just a few occasions. In Rowan County in particular, commissions for justices of the peace and had also been expanded during the regulator years to include some of those German Reformed members. Samuel Souther, who one of the key German Reformed minister in the area, had been alongside the Presbyterians an outspoken critic of the regulators, and had offered his assistance to Governor Tryon prior to Alamance. Governor Josiah Martin noted in the winter of '74 that distinctions and animosities have immemorially prevailed in this country between the people of the established church and the Presbyterians. Disagreements most other concernments. That's probably somewhat of an exaggeration, and I certainly don't want to present the picture agreements in the colony or in the backcountry or on some sort of nicely black and white line between Presbyterian recognition, particularly after Martin had been in the colony for a couple of years, that there were substantial differences in various parts of the colony. It's important to note that in the important years of '74 up until '76, when the Continental Congress is active and the provincial congresses in North Carolina are meeting, and the local committees of safety, these county and district bodies who were charged with implementing the resolves of the Continental Congress and the provincial congresses, that in Rowan and Guilford County, from the available records that survive, the safety minutes, in some cases a little bit of correspondence, and some secondary literature written years later, that these committees and representatives, they were heavily composed of Presbyterians in Guilford, and they immediately attempted to neutralize any kind of opposition. Again, that really juxtaposes with what was going on organize a committee of safety. It did not do so until I think August of 1775. And again, part of this is because the Upper Yadkin settlements were really undergoing a lot of heavy population growth after Alamance. But it's important to note that in Surrey, the divisions are fairly mild. The Surrey Committee of Safety actually is represented by Anglicans, it's represented by Baptists. It even attempts to invite Moravians to participate, although it's sort of a long pattern with them that they tried to stay neutral in controversial matters in particular. But I think it's important to note that in Surrey there were no significant bodies of presbytery that could that had presented any sort of division, anything close to what had been in Guilford in the previous years. There were disagreements, but they did not really come along denominational lines. Well, what does this mean, or what is the importance or the significance of this, and how does it relate to the regulator? A lot of the early historians of North Carolina really cast the regulators in the light of in a couple of examples. Williamson, really the first state historian, called them universally royalists. Joseph Sewell Jones noted that they had offered enthusiastic support to the British, and widely regarded as kind of the first professional historian of North Carolina, academically trained. John Spencer Bassett noticed that some regulators were in position, but the great majority of them were Tories. More modern historians, I think, have kind of tried to separate themselves from that. For one, because there's no comprehensive, regulators who supposedly took the oath of allegiance to the British government after the Battle of Alamance, or came in and surrendered arms. People have tried to reconstruct these things from various court records and correspondence and petitions, but you certainly would not arrive at a number of 6,000. You'd be lucky to get to several hundred. But one of the, I think, fascinating features that arises in this period, and it continues during the Revolution, and it's evident in correspondence, it's evident in criminal action papers and indictments of the period, is that people who were reluctant to join the Continental Association and who remained loyal repeatedly referred to their oaths. Some of them referred to their oaths that they had taken after the Battle of Alamance. Others referred to they just refused to take the oath to the Continental Associations. And two accounts, these are actually written shortly after the Revolution by several patriots who were prominent, was that a lot of these Tories, oath is the equivalent of giving themselves to the devil at once. Another called it treason of the first degree, like the sin against the holy. And I think that's important to grapple with, because I think in this tumultuous time period is that the various religious leaders in the area, ministers, or in some case, in the absence of ministers, lay readers or local church people, were they were influential and had the ability to influence a person's opinion one way or the other. And we see that carried out in the different denominations. Presbyterians really kind of engaged in a threefold tactic during this time period. David Caldwell's sermons, I think it's it's something of the sluggard. It's one of the few surviving colonial era sermons that exist, is a great example of this. But Presbyterians also poured in letters that were distributed throughout the backcountry in this area, in this time period, and it was recognition that some of them had been involved in the regulation, and that the local leadership and the colony needed their favor. And one of the tactics was to absolve parishioners from their oaths to the crown. They also threatened excommunication. There was an awful lot of anti-Catholic rhetoric because Catholicism was associated with the French, and the French were British adversaries, thought to be engaging and kind of stirring up unrest in the frontiers with the Cherokee Indians and other Native American indigenous groups. This rhetoric was powerful. I wanted to read just a brief example. Only weeks after Presbyterian Senate officials asked North Carolinians to consider the establishment of popery in Quebec, a reference to the Quebec Act, the local committee of safety in Rowan, which was chiefly comprised of local Scots-Irish Presbyterians, many of them elders, called its citizens to rouse like one man in defense of our religion from popery, our liberty from slavery, and our lives from tormenting death. Other ministers came to the area in this time period as well. Chief among them, John Gaino, who was by this time lived in the north. But Gaino had been a minister in what is now the Jersey. It was known as the Jersey prior to the French and Indian War. He left in about 1760 or 61. Gaino had brought together a group of Presbyterian, Anglican, and Baptist settlers to sort of form kind of a hodgepodge church in the Jersey settlement, and he was very, very popular. And he married, I think his second wife was a Hunt who lived in the forks of the Yadkin River, the area in Davie County between what's modern Davie County, but at the time was Rowan. Gaino returned to Rowan County in 1775, and we know that according to one account, his very seasonable labors in his old congregation won over many friends to the American cause, including James Smith, who was a local judge of the peace and militia officer, and he had also been at one time a chair of the Rowan County Committee of Safety. Gaino's activities were all in an area where Benjamin Merrill had lived, one of the regulators who was executed. This was an area that Creek and Swearing Creek in modern Davidson County that had a heavy regulator sentiment and allegiance. Conversely, the separate Baptists in this time period actually took a quite different approach. Joseph Murphy, who had been a regulator sympathizer and had been persecuted by Tryon when Tryon marched through the area, he had openly discouraged members of his congregations from signing the Continental Association. Murphy's largest congregation was in the forks of the Yadkin River, but he had also had a couple of satellite congregations that had sprouted up, the furthest west being one at what was called Mulberry Fields, which is modern Wilkesboro. And a contemporary account says that that Murphy openly declared that any of his brethren should sign the Continental Association. Those who did should be censured. By August of 1775, sentiments concern among the Rowan County safety in particular about the sentiment of people in the forks of the Yadkin, where Anglican sentiment had been strong and where separate Baptist affiliation with Murphy's congregations were also strong. And there were also Lutheran meeting sites. The Rowan Committee's leaders were concerned, and they asked the inhabitants of the area to meet with them and confer on the subject of American freedom. Nobody showed up. The people in this area, many of them had already gone into 1775. Not surprisingly, some of the leading forces that would begin to organize the opposition to the Continental Association are documented in multiple accounts of being members of the Church of England. Chief among them was Samuel Bryan, who would go on to be of particular significance after the British invasion in 1780, but also John and William Fields, who lived in Guilford County. When one gets really into the kind of the granular details of some of these families, what we find is the Fields were longtime Anglicans who had immigrated to the Carolina frontier from Adams County, Pennsylvania, shortly after their father had died, and he's buried in the local church cemetery there. They, along with others like Henry Harmon, who's sometimes referred to as Herman or Hartman, in what is now Davidson County, but at the time east of the Yadkin River in Rowan County. Harmon was also a family. Accounts make that very clear. Harmon had also been a very active agitator among the Regulators, and he was a militia captain. The Revolution, or in 1775, he was a captain of militia in that area. I didn't include his name here, but William Spurgeon, who would later become a chief instigator in the Moores Creek Uprising, would immigrate to Nova Scotia, where he would become affiliated with the Church of England there too. So these are just sort of, I think, a handful of anecdotal examples. But I would add that I can add onto this list substantially, and it becomes during the Revolution, it becomes even more clear of some of these loyalties. The German population presents kind of an interesting, study, but there's evidence of deepening divisions in this time period between Reformed and Lutheran congregations. Notably, George Spraker, who was a Lutheran elder in a congregation on Abbott's Creek, he is also summoned before the Rowan County Committee to sort of to come a calling of account into his loyalties in 1775. Meanwhile, Samuel Souther and other reformers, there's significant evidence that they remained aligned with their Presbyterian neighbors. But some of the churches that had been German Reformed and Lutheran that had often worshipped together were splintering. That's in the earlier 1770s, but it continued into the Revolutionary period, and some accounts suggest that during the Revolution itself. The failure of the Moores Creek Uprising is, I think, can be attributed to many accounts, but one of the reasons that Moores Creek was a grand failure for the British was that it failed to arouse widespread support among previously Regulator sympathizers and people who were inclined to support the cause in 75, 76. I should restate that and say it did not fail to arouse support. It failed to get that support and coalesce it and unite it with the Highland Scots that had assembled in the Loyalists in the forks of the Yadkin in the winter of 75 and early 76. And William Fields assembled a regiment in Guilford County. And among his regiment was Seymour York, whose land the Baptist church had been constructed on in what would become Guilford County. These groups were largely successfully disbanded and obstructed by Presbyterian militia groups with the support of two companies of largely German Reformed militia groups in early January and February of 1776. In fact, when in the wake of Moores Creek, two rode out with the companies of local Guilford and Rowan and Mecklenburg and some of the other backcountry Presbyterian militia groups to cut off the retreat of loyalists, and they were accompanied by what is believed to be Samuel Souther and also a Presbyterian clergyman at the same time. And I realize I think I'm kind of hit my end here, so I'm sorry to wrap this up, but I wanted to leave some time for questions also. And then just also encourage researchers to, I know the archives has been hampered by the pandemic, but we've made a lot of digital resources available that document the key period of the regulation. And I encourage you to visit our website, encourage you to visit our digital collections. You're also more than welcome to email me anytime if you have questions about other resources. Most of the colonial era resources where the archives has original documents, whether it's county or state government like General Assembly documents, governor's office materials, these are now widely available online. The difficulty in just knowing where to find them, and I'm happy to help you do that or answer questions about that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Van. That was great. I will echo the great resource that the State Archives of North Carolina has in digital collections, and people like Van have been working really hard to put a lot of primary sources out there so that people like me can sit in our jammies and go through regulator files from the comfort of our home. I am curious, Van, like what's the status of things like with the reading room or research room at the archives right now, and what is I know it's hard to predict the future, but what are things looking like right now?
Sure. So we are open to the public now in a limited capacity in the search room. And so we're offering appointments between the hours of 1 and 4. So they're reduced hours. And then there's reduced visitation too. And then I think our staff are on site on a rotating basis. And so we do have staff available, and we're trying to do as much remote kind of research for whether it be genealogists or historians in whatever capacity they would like. And I think, we're like anybody else. We'll get back to more normal soon.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so for those of you who have questions for Van, please leave them in the chat. There are a couple here, but I'm going to take my privilege as the MC and ask a couple questions here. And you'll have to excuse me. You were in and out a couple times on my end, so if you did already talk about this, forgive me. But you talk a little bit about how Governor Tryon made some concessions to the Presbyterians. He sort of tried to court them for a couple different reasons, and then Josiah Martin sort of takes a almost opposite tack. What is it that causes both of them to take the positions that they do in how they relate with the Presbyterians during that time?
Sure. So I think I'd encourage you to read Dr. Troxler's book, and Marjorie Carr's book also, I think, really gets at this. And there are a couple of good articles also that tackle the question. But the structure of county government in the backcountry, it was heavily composed of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, and the truth is that Tryon needed their support to basically subdue the regulator movement. So he did offer some concessions, I think, with the understanding that I think he knew the likelihood that these would not put up under closer scrutiny. But I think it's also important to point out that Tryon's predecessor was Arthur. Dobbs was an Ulster Scot and had a close connection with a lot the backcountry. And the process of granting concessions to them was one that really predated Tryon's kind of tactic, in that you wanted Protestant dissenters on the frontiers to protect them from indigenous peoples. And so the act of concession giving, it was not unique to North Carolina. but it was something that had been ongoing for some time. Martin, though, I think, particularly after he took a tour of the backcountry and visited with the regulators and spoke to them, began to realize that many of the regulator opponents, they were dissenters. They were in fact Presbyterians, particularly in Rowan County, um, and uh, and that they had blocked the installation of Anglican rectors, and that they were themselves, in some cases, responsible for a lot of the corruption that was being, alleged. And so, I think, personalities may have something to do with that. Um, but I think it was a willingness, at least on Martin's part, to really look at the problem uh, in a fresh lens, and try to address it.
Yeah, thanks. It's really true that you've got two separate administrations that sort of, one helps put down, Tryon puts down the regulator movement, is there for almost the entire thing, and then Martin is there to sort of pick up the pieces afterward. And it's two separate people, two completely different feelings, two administrations. And I'm particularly glad that you spoke a little bit about the historiography of the like late 19th and early 20th century of the regulators, and this idea of all the regulators being royalists or loyalists. And really it's just so much more complicated. And anytime we take a closer look at political allegiances in North Carolina during this time, it's really hard to draw a through line with most people. The way I've described it, if you take all of your people and you put them into a box on either side, with one particular issue, after that issue is done, you go ahead and shake up the box. And that's kind of what happens from the regulator movement into the revolution. And some people stay on the same side, some people move over, and a bunch of things happen that just make it really complicated, but very interesting. So I'm going to read a couple questions here. One from Linda Allred Cooper. Where could I find the Presbyterian records available for Old Rowan and Old Guilford? And she notes that she's particularly interested in Northeast Randolph County and the Allred family. This is a family history question.
So first off, hey Linda, I know Linda. I hope you're doing well. One of the great ironies of and I think all the previous presenters, I think, showed this in some way of the great challenges of doing colonial and revolutionary history in North Carolina is that while the Moravians and Quakers, which were in fact sort of minority groups in the backcountry, kept great records, and we have a lot of those records still to work with. The larger denominations, like the Presbyterians, and I would argue that there's significant evidence of at least some sort of some sort of, even if it's a simple allegiance to some of the customs of the church, the denominational records for those are lacking. And so it makes it very difficult to piece things together. In fact, Linda, there are original minute books for the Presbyterian congregations that date into the colonial era. Area, those minutes do pick up. I think it might be it may be slightly into the colonial era, but I think it's more in the revolutionary time period. For example, it's been a while since I've looked at these, but I know that after the Guilford Courthouse battle, there is a reference in those minutes to British soldiers who were, it was either British or local soldiers. I think it was British soldiers who were nursed and doctored in the local meeting house there. So the answer to your question is there are no great local denominational records. There are those synod and general assembly records that you can find references to ministers passing through the areas. And I'm happy I can try to take that question if you want to email me sometime and point you in the sources.
And your email address, is it all right if I drop that into the chat for folks to see?
Sure.
Okay. Question from Sandy Lewis. Is there a resource for the regiment assembled by William Fields that may give enlistees?
Not all. Um, most of these people were arrested and rounded up in early 1770. The key leaders like the Fields were taken to Halifax, where the fourth and fifth provincial congresses met, and there was a committee that basically investigated the insurgents, and so there you can get a glimpse of some of those people, like Seymour York, like the Fields. I think there Jackson's in that list, if my memory serves, um, maybe Brookshire's. So you can get a glimpse of some of them, but you cannot get a sort of individual by individual list of who all of those people were.
All right, there's another question here, again related to documentation, from an ancestor, or excuse me, a descendant of Samuel Flake. Is there a copy of the petition that was signed by the regulators? And can you talk a little bit about the nature of the regulator documents that we do have access to?
Sure, this is a time, and I think there are really three bodies of records that contain regulator documents and petitions. One are the General Assembly session records, where regulator petitions were brought before one of the colonial bodies. These are all digital now and available on our website. They may not be name searchable, but you can certainly search broadly, like Regulators or Rowan County or Guilford County or something along those lines. The second group are papers of the governor's office, the governor's papers. And I would say about 75% of those are available digitally on our website. I do know of some others, and I think that during the America 250th celebration years, I think we will make an even greater effort to make more material available digitally. Now, I will say, Carol alluded to this, I think, earlier, that a lot of these records do appear in some fashion in the first and second series of the colonial records, but oftentimes they were not transcribed correctly. And so they may be misspelled, especially if you have a unique knowledge of a particular area. These things stand out to you. The third records that we are records that we do not have originals of, but they lie in British archives. And in those cases, we have a lot of copies of these materials. And these records are not all online. And so I think if you have a question about a particular ancestor and you were trying to find it, my advice would be to email our office, and if you can link us to the resource where you saw it published, I can certainly help you find it, whether it's something that's digital or not.
All right, thank you so much, Van. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us throughout our four speakers presentations. And I'd like to thank Dr. Troxler, Dr. Stewart, Mark Chilton, and Vann Evans for giving some really great talks today. And thanks so much to the staff and faculty at Alamance Community College for hosting this as part of the Waterways program. It's been great working with you all. And again, as I said at the beginning of the morning, stay tuned on facebook.com/Alamance Battleground SHS for more digital content around the Battle of Alamance 250th, May 15th, 16th of 2021. Sherry, you got anything to add before we shut this down?